The tyrant burned my kingdom to ash and forced a fated mate bond upon my soul. He thought he had locked me in a cage of his own design. He didn't realize I was the one holding the leash. 5 years later, I sit on his throne and rule his unstoppable empire. And the most feared king in the world willingly wears cold iron chains in the deepest dungeon, begging for the moment I finally come down to visit him in the dark. Welcome to Luna's secret library. Sometimes the most unexpected turns lead us exactly where we need to be. What happens next is something I never saw coming, and I think you'll find it just as surprising. Stick around for the conclusion. It's a reminder that it's never too late for a new chapter. If you enjoy discovering these hidden gems, I'd be honored to have you follow for more. The ash of my burning kingdom fell like grey snow across my torn wedding dress. I refused to wipe the soot and blood from my face. My knees bruised against the shattered marble of the ancient throne room. I stared up at the man who had just slaughtered my entire lineage. King Dominic did not look like a savage monster. He possessed a lean, sculpted elegance that defied the sheer brutality of his actions. There was no bulky, monstrous mass to his frame. Instead, he moved with the sinewy, fluid grace of a predatory cat. His dark armor was pristine, untouched by the chaos he had orchestrated. The metallic scent of death mingled heavily with the smoke of centuries-old tapestries. He stepped over the fallen crown of my father without glancing down. My heart pounded a frantic, erratic rhythm against my ribs. I waited for the cold bite of his sword against my neck. I was the last surviving royal of the Crescent Court. My execution should have been the final victory in his ruthless campaign. Yet, he stopped mere inches from where I knelt in the ruins. The grand hall fell into a suffocating, terrifying silence. His soldiers stood like obsidian statues in the shadows of the destroyed pillars. Dominic slowly lowered his blood-stained blade to the floor. The sound of the metal scraping against the stone sent a violent shiver down my spine. He crouched before me, bringing his striking, angular face level with mine. His eyes were a piercing, unnatural shade of amber. They burned with a terrifying intensity that made my breath hitch. I forced myself to meet his gaze, channeling every ounce of my hatred into my stare. I wanted him to see the absolute revulsion burning in my soul. Instead of anger, a strange, possessive heat flared in his amber eyes. He reached out slowly, stripping off his iron gauntlet. His bare fingers were long, elegant, and completely steady. I flinched as his knuckles brushed against the dirt on my cheek. The moment his skin made contact with mine, a violent shockwave tore through my veins. It was an electric, undeniable spark of ancient magic. My breath caught in my throat as the primal truth slammed into my mind. He was not just a conquering king. He was my fated mate. The universe had tethered my soul to the architect of my total destruction. A low, vibrating growl rumbled deep within Dominic's chest. It was a sound of absolute satisfaction and ancient claim. I slapped his hand away with all the fading strength I possessed. The sharp sound echoed violently across the silent, ruined hall. His soldiers instantly drew their weapons in response to my defiance. Dominic simply raised a single, elegant finger to stop them. He did not break eye contact with me for even a fraction of a second. A slow, chilling smile touched the corners of his mouth. He traced the red mark my hand had left on his pale skin. I pushed myself backward, trying to put distance between my body and his overwhelming aura. "You are a monster," I whispered, my voice trembling with unfiltered rage. Dominic tilted his head, his expression softening into a mask of twisted devotion. "I am your king, Sophia," he murmured, his voice a dark, velvet caress. I spat on the marble floor between us. "I would rather burn in these ashes than bow to you." He leaned closer, the scent of pine and dark magic wrapping around my senses. "You will not burn, my beautiful little bird." He gripped my chin, his fingers possessing a terrifying, inescapable strength. You will sit beside me on the throne I carved from your father's bones. I thrashed against his hold, desperation clawing at my throat. I reject this bond, I screamed, the words tearing at my vocal cords. I reject you, Dominic. The amber light in his eyes darkened into something utterly obsessive. You cannot reject what the gods have chained together. He stood up, pulling me effortlessly to my feet with one hand. My legs buckled, but his firm grip against my waist kept me standing. He pressed me flush against his hard, armored chest. The cruel irony of his physical warmth disgusted me to my core. Prepare the high temple, Dominic commanded, his voice carrying the absolute weight of a sovereign. He looked down at me, his gaze mapping every curve of my furious, tear-stained face. Tonight, the Crescent Princess becomes my fully bonded queen. I began to thrash violently, fighting him with my fists, my nails, and my teeth. He simply gathered my struggling body into his arms as easily as carrying a child. Scream all you want, Sophia, he whispered into my hair. No one is coming to save you from me. The obsidian carriage rattled along the mountain pass, carrying me away from the ruins of my life. Every jolt of the iron wheels vibrated through my bruised bones and aching muscles. Outside the barred window, the jagged peaks of the northern kingdom loomed like dark teeth against the twilight sky. This was Dominic's domain, a bleak fortress built entirely on stone, blood, and cold conquest. I pressed my forehead against the frosty glass, refusing to let a single tear fall down my face. Tears were a luxury for the broken, and I needed every ounce of my remaining pride to survive. The memory of my father's fallen crown still burned behind my closed eyelids. I could still smell the smoke of the Crescent Court, the home I would never see again. The heavy iron gates of the fortress ground open, swallowing the carriage into the shadows of the inner courtyard. A dozen silent soldiers lined the stone steps, their expressions hidden behind polished steel visors. The carriage door clicked open, and there he stood, waiting for me. Dominic reached out a long hand, his bare fingers steady and completely relaxed. I ignored his gesture entirely, gripping the frame of the door to drag myself out onto the stones. My legs trembled beneath the weight of my torn wedding dress, but I forced my chin high. I stared directly into his amber eyes, wanting him to see the absolute hatred in my gaze. He let out a quiet, amused hum, dropping his hand back to his side without a trace of anger. Your pride will either save you or destroy you, Sophia, he said, his voice smooth as silk. It will destroy you first, I spat, stepping past him into the freezing mountain wind. Two silent handmaidens immediately flanked me, their heads bowed in absolute submission to their king. They led me through cavernous stone corridors lined with tapestries depicting victories I despised. The air inside the fortress smelled of burning tallow, ancient dust, and old magic. I was pushed into a massive bedchamber dominated by a heavy, four-poster bed made of dark oak. On the mattress lay a new gown woven from midnight blue velvet, stitched with silver threads that gleamed like stars. The handmaidens approached me with silver basins of warm water and scented oils. Touch me, and I will make sure you never breathe again, I hissed, retreating to the wall. They paused, looking past me toward the doorway where a tall shadow had just fallen. Dominic stepped into the room, dismissing the servants with a subtle wave of his hand. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind them, leaving us entirely alone in the quiet room. The silence became suffocating, filled only with the crackle of the hearth fire. He walked toward me with that fluid, predatory grace, his boots making no sound on the rugs. I searched the room frantically for a weapon, my eyes landing on a silver fire poker. Before I could even take a step, Dominic was in front of me, shutting down all escape. He pinned my wrists against the stone wall above my head with one effortless movement. His grip did not hurt, but it was absolute, like iron wrapped in the softest velvet. His lean, muscular chest pressed against mine, and that terrifying spark of the bond fled instantly. My breath caught in my throat, my treacherous heart betraying me by leaping wildly. A golden warmth spread through my veins, pulling my soul toward the monster who destroyed my world. "Let go of me," I choked out, twisting desperately beneath his unyielding weight. "You tremble, my beautiful little bird," he murmured, leaning down until his lips almost touched my ear. "Is it from fear, or is it because the bond is finally singing in your blood?" "It is disgust," I whispered, glaring at him with all the malice I possessed. "Every second you stand near me makes me want to tear my own skin away." His jaw tightened slightly, a fleeting shadow of real pain crossing his striking features. But the vulnerability vanished as quickly as it came, replaced by that dark, unyielding obsession. "The gods do not make mistakes, Sophia," he said, his voice dropping to a low, vibrating rumble. "They broke your kingdom so you could finally find your true place by my side. My family is dead because of your cruelty," I screamed, tears finally blurring my vision. "My people are bleeding in the ruins because of your sick ambition." He reached up with one hand, his thumb catching a stray tear before it could fall. The warmth of his skin sent a cruel, confusing shiver straight down my spine. "I fought a brutal war to claim what belongs to me," Dominic said softly, his eyes burning. "And tonight, the entire court will watch me bind your soul to mine forever." He released my wrists and stepped back, gesturing toward the midnight blue gown on the bed. "Dress yourself, my queen," he commanded gently, though the authority in his tone was absolute. "The high priest is already waiting in the temple, and I am not a patient man." He turned and walked out, leaving me alone with the crushing weight of my fate. I looked at the beautiful, cursed dress, knowing that tonight, a new kind of war would begin. I would wear his velvet, and I would walk to his altar, but I would never belong to him. I would find a way to make him bleed for every soul he took from me. The bond might tie our spirits together, but my heart would remain his eternal executioner. The heavy ironwood doors of my bedchamber groaned open to reveal a phalanx of heavily armored guards. They did not speak as they fell into a flawless, intimidating formation around me. I was escorted down the winding, abyssal corridors of the ancient mountain fortress. Torches cast long, flickering shadows against the damp, weeping stone walls of the keep. My midnight blue velvet gown brushed against the uneven floorboards like the rustle of a restless ghost. The silver threads woven into the heavy fabric caught the dim light, mocking my complete lack of freedom. Every step I took was a measured march toward the definitive execution of my autonomy. A distant, rhythmic chanting of forgotten hymns echoed up from the hidden bowels of the castle. The air grew steadily colder, carrying the unmistakable scent of burning incense and spilled wine. We finally arrived before a pair of towering obsidian doors carved with the intricate depictions of predatory wolves. The doors swung inward with a deafening rumble that vibrated through the soles of my shoes. The high temple of the Northern Kingdom revealed itself in a stunning, terrifying display of barbaric opulence. Thousands of black candles floated suspended in the cavernous space, dripping wax onto the polished obsidian floor. The entire sovereign court was gathered in the shadows, their eyes glittering with hostile curiosity. They were waiting to see the broken, weeping princess of the Crescent Court beg for mercy. I locked my jaw, forcing my spine completely straight despite the crushing weight of my despair. I would never give these butchers the satisfaction of witnessing my absolute terror. At the far end of the grand hall stood the sacrificial altar, carved from a single slab of white marble. Dominic waited for me on the raised dais, looking less like a mortal king and more like a dark god of war. He wore ceremonial robes of midnight silk that clung perfectly to his lean, fiercely sculpted torso. There was a distinctly sinuous grace to his posture, an elegant lethality completely devoid of bulky clumsiness. His amber eyes locked onto mine the exact moment I crossed the threshold into the temple. The intensity of his gaze was a physical weight, pressing down against my lungs and stealing my breath. The gathered nobility parted like a shadowed sea, creating a silent path for my slow, agonizing procession. I walked past the very generals who had ordered the burning of my beloved childhood home. I could see the faint smudges of my people's blood still staining the edges of their polished armor. My fingernails dug so deeply into my own palms that I felt the sharp sting of broken skin. When I finally reached the base of the marble steps, Dominic descended gracefully to meet me. He offered his bare, perfectly formed hand, his expression an unreadable mask of absolute authority. I stared at his outstretched fingers, every instinct screaming at me to strike him across the face. A subtle, dangerous shift in his amber eyes warned me of the severe consequences of public defiance. I slowly placed my trembling hand into his, my skin crawling at the instantaneous surge of heat between us. His long fingers closed securely around mine, his grip possessing that same velvet-wrapped iron strength. He led me up the final steps toward the waiting figure of the high priest. The ancient holy man wore robes the color of dried blood, his face hidden entirely beneath a heavy cowl. A silver chalice and a wicked, curved dagger rested on the stark white surface of the altar. The high priest began to chant in a guttural, forgotten tongue that resonated in the marrow of my bones. The ancient magic in the room responded immediately, making the flames of the black candles flare violently. Dominic turned to face me, pulling me impossibly close until the heat of his body enveloped me completely. "Do not fight the magic, Sophia," he whispered, his voice a dark, hypnotic caress against my ear. "It will only tear your mind apart if you try to deny the truth of our souls." I tilted my chin up defiantly, my eyes burning with a hatred so pure it felt holy. "My soul belongs entirely to the ash of my kingdom," I hissed quietly through clenched teeth. The high priest stepped forward, raising the ceremonial dagger into the flickering candlelight. Dominic held out his left hand, entirely unfazed as the sharp blade sliced deeply across his palm. Dark, rich blood welled to the surface instantly, dripping with a heavy rhythm into the waiting silver chalice. The priest then reached out and took my wrist, his grip surprisingly strong for such an ancient creature. I flinched sharply as the cold steel bit ruthlessly into my own flesh. My blood joined Dominic's in the chalice, swirling together in a macabre dance of forced union. The high priest raised the cup toward the domed ceiling, his chanting reaching a feverish, echoing pitch. He suddenly thrust his hand into the chalice, coating his fingers in our mingled blood. Before I could pull away, he pressed his blooded fingers firmly against the center of my forehead. The moment the liquid touched my skin, an explosive shockwave of pure, agonizing magic ripped through my body. It felt as though liquid fire had been injected directly into my veins, racing frantically toward my heart. I gasped, my knees buckling as the overwhelming power of the ancient mate bond snapped firmly into place. Dominic caught me effortlessly around the waist, holding me flush against his sinewy, powerful frame. Through the magical tether, I could suddenly feel the terrifying depth of his possessive obsession. It was a suffocating, bottomless ocean of dark desire, entirely focused on keeping me caged by his side. He reached up, his thumb gently wiping a stray bead of sweat from my temple. "You are mine," he stated, the words echoing not just in the silent temple, but directly inside my mind. The high priest turned to the altar and lifted a delicate, breathtaking crown wrought from dark silver. It was studded with raw black diamonds that seemed to absorb the surrounding light. Dominic took the crown from the priest's hands, his movements deliberate and overwhelmingly reverent. He placed the cold metal carefully atop my head, the sharp edges tangling slightly in my hair. "Behold your queen," Dominic's voice thundered out across the vast, silent hall, commanding absolute obedience. The entire court sank to their knees in perfect unison, the sound of armor clanking against the stone floor. They bowed their heads to the woman they had conquered, forced to revere the spoil of their brutal war. Dominic looked down at me, a terrifyingly tender smile finally breaking his stoic facade. He believed he had won, having bound my body and my magic to his eternal service. But as I stood there wearing his crown and bearing his mark, My mind became a fortress of cold calculation. He wanted a fated mate to warm his bed and legitimize his violent rule. I would give him the illusion of submission, wearing this velvet dress and this dark crown. I would become the venom coursing silently through the veins of his vast empire. He had tied our souls together, but he had forgotten that a tether works in both directions. If I was destined to fall into the abyss, I would make absolutely certain I dragged him down with me. The heavy obsidian doors of the royal bedchamber closed, severing me from the hostile eyes of the court. I stood perfectly still in the center of the vast, silent room. The black diamond crown on my head felt heavier than a physical executioner's block. Every fiber of my midnight blue velvet gown felt like a suffocating shroud wrapped around my lungs. The magic of the blood bond pulsed steadily beneath my skin, a constant, violating hum. It tied my very heartbeat to the monster who had turned my beautiful home into a mass graveyard. The walls of this chamber were draped in thick, dark tapestries depicting ancient, violent conquests. I felt entirely swallowed by the sheer scale of his oppressive, stone-cold world. Even the air in this room felt heavy, scented with crushed cedar and the metallic tang of his dark magic. I refused to look at the massive silk-draped bed dominating the space. Instead, I stared blindly into the roaring flames of the massive stone hearth. I needed the heat to thaw the absolute ice that had permanently settled into my marrow. A soft click echoed behind me, signaling the unlocking of the heavy chamber door. I did not turn around. I knew exactly who had entered the room without needing to see his face. The dark, magnetic energy of his presence flooded the space instantly. Through the newly forged magical tether, I could feel the sharp spike of his overwhelming relief. Dominic was finally completely alone with his ultimate, stolen prize. I heard the quiet thud of his heavy ceremonial cloak hitting the floorboards. His footsteps were completely silent as he crossed the thick carpets toward me. He stopped just behind me, radiating a furious, possessive heat that made my skin crawl. "You were magnificent tonight," Dominic murmured, his voice a low, vibrating purr. "You faced the monsters of the north and made them all bow to you." I let out a harsh, bitter laugh that sounded entirely devoid of any human joy. I faced the biggest monster of them all, and he forced a crown upon my head. A heavy silence stretched between us, thick with unspoken tension and ancient magic. I felt his long, elegant fingers lightly brush the stray hair at the nape of my neck. I flinched violently, stepping sideways to break his terrifyingly gentle contact. "Do not touch me," I ordered, my voice shaking with unadulterated venom. Dominic did not pursue me, standing perfectly still in the flickering firelight. Without the heavy armor, his lean, sculpted physique was even more intimidatingly apparent. He looked like a lethal shadow carved by a masterful artist, devoid of any clumsy bulk. There was no arrogant triumph in his striking amber eyes now. Instead, I saw a raw, almost desperate hunger that unsettled me deeply. He had orchestrated this entire nightmare just to claim a mate the universe had randomly assigned him. I wondered if he felt any genuine remorse when he watched my father's blood stain the throne room floor. Looking at his perfectly composed face now, I highly doubted he possessed a functioning conscience. "The bond demands closeness, Sophia," he said softly, a hint of genuine physical strain in his tone. "It is tearing at my chest to stand this far away from you." Yet, the bond betrayed his outward stoicism, pulsing with a frantic need for my absolute approval. It was a pathetic, desperate craving hidden beneath the guise of a ruthless conqueror. I looked at him, realizing for the first time the true, fatal vulnerability of a fated mate. The magic had given him ultimate claim over my life, but it had also irrevocably chained his sanity to my emotions. "Then let it tear you apart," I answered coldly, meeting his intense gaze without flinching. "I hope it shreds your heart into the exact same ashes you made of my kingdom." A flicker of profound, agonizing pain crossed his beautifully severe features. Through the magical tether, I felt the sharp ache in his chest reflecting the cruelty of my own words. I realized suddenly that I could feel the exact rhythm of his heartbeat echoing against my own ribs. The connection was entirely a two-way street. He could force my body into his remote fortress, but he could not force my soul to feel anything but hatred. I intentionally focused on the burning rage and absolute disgust churning in my empty stomach. I gathered every ounce of my grief for my fallen people. I pushed those toxic, violent emotions deliberately down the golden thread of our unbreakable bond. Dominic actually took a half-step backward, his breath catching sharply in the quiet room. His jaw tightened dangerously as he absorbed the full, unfiltered force of my psychological revulsion. "You are poisoning our connection," he whispered, staring at me with a complex mixture of awe and sorrow. "I am giving you exactly what you asked for," I replied, lifting my chin in pure defiance. "You wanted my soul, King Dominic. This is what is left of it." He slowly closed his eyes, taking a deep, shuddering breath to steady his trembling frame. When he opened them again, the desperate hunger had been masked entirely by his iron will. "I have centuries to teach you how to love me, little bird," he promised quietly. "You do not have a heart left to win," I countered, crossing my arms defensively over my chest. Every instinct I possessed urged me to fight, to scream, to tear down the stone walls with my bare hands. But my survival depended on a much colder, much more calculated approach. I needed to become the perfect, untouchable statue he had unfortunately created. He walked slowly toward a silver basin resting on a carved mahogany table. He wet a fine linen cloth, completely ignoring his own bleeding palm from the earlier blood ritual. "Sit by the fire," he instructed gently, intentionally keeping his eyes averted from mine. "You are shivering, and the mountain air is notoriously unforgiving." I remained standing exactly where I was, refusing to obey even the simplest, most benevolent command. I would let him starve on my emotional silence. He turned around, the damp cloth in his steady hand, and let out a very soft sigh. He did not force me into the velvet chair. Instead, he knelt on the hard stone floor right in front of me. The most feared tyrant in the known world voluntarily lowered his entire being to my feet. He carefully took my hands, his touch terrifyingly gentle, and began to wipe the dried blood from my skin. I stared down at the top of his dark head, utterly confused by this jarring display of servitude. "I will wait for you," Dominic murmured, his thumb tracing the newly healed scar on my palm. "I will endure your hatred, your poison, and your endless rage." He looked up at me, his amber eyes shining with a terrifying, absolute devotion. "But I will never let you go." I looked down at the man kneeling before me, the sole architect of my ultimate destruction. He had bound my body to his side forever, trapping me in his icy domain. But as I watched him carefully clean my hands, a cold, brilliant realization settled into my mind. I held the invisible leash to his sanity. And I was going to pull it until his mind completely shattered. The harsh morning light offered absolutely no warmth to the unforgiving stone corridors of the northern keep. I refused to wear the heavy, jewel-encrusted gowns the handmaidens had prepared for my first day as queen. Instead, I demanded a simple dress woven from charcoal wool, the traditional mourning color of my fallen people. The servants were too terrified of my newly established status to deny my cold, unwavering commands. They dressed me in absolute silence, their eyes darting nervously toward the black diamond crown resting on my vanity. I placed the heavy silver and diamond circlet upon my own head, feeling the cold bite of the metal against my scalp. It was not a symbol of my reign, but a heavy chain reminding me of the blood spilled to forge it. I walked out of the bedchamber, my spine perfectly straight, channeling the sovereign pride of my ancestors. The heavily armored guards stationed at my door immediately snapped to attention and fell into step behind me. I did not ask for directions to the great hall, letting the distant echo of harsh, military voices guide my path. Every step I took was a calculated move in the psychological war I had declared against my fated mate. The massive iron doors of the great hall stood open, revealing the brutal, chaotic heart of Dominic's empire. Dozens of battle-hardened warlords and generals stood around a massive stone table mapping the conquered territories. Dominic sat upon his jagged iron throne at the far end of the hall, radiating absolute, terrifying authority. He wore a sharply tailored tunic of dark leather that highlighted his lean, predatory physique perfectly. There was no clumsy, monstrous bulk to his frame, only the devastating, coiled elegance of a deadly weapon. He was currently reprimanding a high-ranking lord, his voice entirely devoid of warmth or human mercy. The entire court froze in collective shock the moment my charcoal wool dress swept past the iron doors. The brutal warlords parted instantly, creating a wide, silent path for me to approach the dais. Dominic stopped speaking mid-sentence, his amber eyes locking onto me with a terrifying, magnetic intensity. Through the invisible golden tether of our bond, I felt a massive wave of his relief and dark obsession crash over me. He had expected me to hide in my chambers, to weep over my shattered life like a broken captive. He clearly did not understand that grief had transformed my heart into a weapon of mass destruction. I stopped at the base of the throne, refusing to lower my head or offer even the slightest gesture of respect. "My queen," Dominic murmured, his voice softening so drastically it sent a visible ripple of shock through his generals. He extended his elegant, scar-marked hand toward me, silently inviting me to take the seat beside him. I completely ignored his outstretched fingers, keeping my hands folded calmly against my dark mourning dress. I turned my attention away from the king and fixed a dead, chilling stare on the men gathered around the map table. My eyes instantly recognized the sneering face of General Vane, a man whose armor still bore the scratches of crescent blades. Vane stood near the center of the table, his heavy hand resting arrogantly upon a folded pile of azure silk. A wave of pure, suffocating nausea rolled through my stomach as I recognized the fabric. It was the sacred royal banner of my family, torn directly from the central spire of my ruined home. Vane noticed my stare and offered a cruel, mocking bow that dripped with blatant disrespect. "A spoil of our glorious war, Your Grace," Vane declared loudly, making sure the entire hall heard his provocation. I thought it might make a fitting rug for the royal hounds. The hall went utterly, dangerously silent, every man waiting to see how the new, conquered queen would react. I did not scream, I did not cry, and I did not address the disrespectful general at all. Instead, I closed my eyes and focused entirely on the magical bond tying my soul to the tyrant on the throne. I gathered every ounce of the crushing agony, the bleeding trauma, and the burning hatred festering in my chest. I shaped those toxic emotions into a mental spear and drove it violently down the tether directly into Dominic's heart. A sharp, violent gasp echoed from the throne, shattering the silence of the massive hall. I opened my eyes and watched with cold satisfaction as Dominic physically folded forward, gripping his chest. His knuckles turned stark white as he clutched the dark leather of his tunic, his breathing suddenly ragged and shallow. The bond forced him to experience the exact, unfiltered agony I felt looking at the defiled banner of my ancestors. "Your Majesty," one of the guards shouted, taking a panicked step toward the dais. Dominic raised a shaking hand, his amber eyes completely blown wide as he stared down at me in raw agony. He was drowning in my manufactured sorrow, completely paralyzed by the empathic backlash of the mate bond. I looked up at him, my expression a mask of flawless, unfeeling marble. "Does my presence displease your loyal butchers, my king?" I asked, my voice echoing clearly in the stunned room. Dominic swallowed hard, a fine layer of sweat breaking out across his pale, sharply angled forehead. He forced himself to sit upright, his amber eyes shifting slowly from my face to the smirking General Vane. The sudden, lethal shift in the king's demeanor made the temperature in the great hall plummet drastically. "Bring me the banner," Dominic commanded, his voice dropping into a demonic, echoing register that promised immediate death. Vane's smirk vanished instantly, replaced by a deep, genuine confusion as he slowly picked up the azure silk. He walked forward and offered the torn flag to the throne, his eyes darting nervously toward his sovereign. Dominic stood up with a terrifying, fluid grace, snatching the fabric from the general's thick hands. "You dare insult the queen in her own court?" Dominic asked softly, the quiet tone far more dangerous than a scream. "She is a spoil of war, sire," Vane stammered, his military arrogance crumbling under the king's unnatural wrath. "She is your god," Dominic corrected, stepping down from the dais and coming to a halt directly in front of the general. Before anyone could blink, Dominic's lean hand shot out, wrapping securely around Vane's armored throat. He lifted the massive, heavily armed general off the floor with a terrifying display of effortless, brutal strength. Vane choked and kicked, his hands clawing uselessly at the iron grip crushing his windpipe. The entire court watched in absolute horror as their undisputed leader turned against his most decorated commander. "Strip him of his rank," Dominic ordered, casually tossing the gasping general onto the unforgiving stone floor. "Throw him in the lower dungeons until he forgets how to speak the language of the Crescent Court." Guards instantly rushed forward, dragging the humiliated and broken general out of the silent hall. Dominic turned back to me, carefully smoothing the wrinkles from my family's torn azure banner. He knelt on the cold stone before the entire court, a tyrant willingly submitting to the ghost of a dead kingdom. He gently placed the folded silk into my waiting hands, looking up at me with desperate, pain-filled eyes. Through the bond, he silently begged me to ease the crushing mental torture I was inflicting upon his mind. I took the banner, maintaining my icy composure, and deliberately severed the flow of projected agony. Dominic let out a long, shuddering breath as the suffocating pressure finally vanished from his chest. He had just alienated his most powerful warlords simply to appease the wrath of a captive bride. I looked out at the terrified, bewildered faces of the northern generals standing around the map table. They realized in that exact moment that their invincible king was hopelessly leashed to a monster of his own making. I clutched my family's banner to my chest, a tiny, undetectable smile forming deep within my soul. The Northern Empire was an impregnable fortress from the outside, but I was already poisoning it from the inside out. The moon hung like a jagged silver scythe over the freezing peaks of the northern kingdom. I stood on the expansive stone balcony of my chambers, letting the violent wind bite into my skin. The charcoal wool of my morning dress offered absolutely no protection against the midnight chill. I preferred the physical numbness of the cold to the suffocating, heavy heat of the royal bedchamber. Below me, the massive obsidian fortress was entirely silent, but it was a deeply fragile, tense quiet. My calculated actions in the Great Hall had sent a devastating tremor through the foundation of Dominic's iron rule. I had successfully forced the undefeated king to publicly cripple his own military command. The loyalists of the disgraced General Vane were undoubtedly whispering treason in the dark shadows of the keep. A soft, almost imperceptible scrape of metal against stone abruptly pulled me from my dark thoughts. It did not come from the heavy oak doors inside my heavily guarded room. The sound echoed faintly from the sheer, icy cliff face directly below my balcony. I leaned over the stone balustrade, my eyes slowly adjusting to the deep, oppressive darkness of the gorge. 3 figures clad entirely in black leather were scaling the fortress wall with terrifying, unnatural speed. They moved with the synchronized, lethal grace of highly trained royal assassins. Their ultimate target was undeniably the new captive queen who had publicly humiliated their warlord. I did not scream for the heavily armed royal guard stationed just outside my bedroom door. I did not step backward into the relative safety of the thick stone walls. A dark, twisted sense of curiosity held me entirely captive at the very edge of the balcony. If they succeeded in driving a blade through my heart, I would finally be free from the agonizing magic of the mate bond. If they failed, I would get the profound pleasure of watching Dominic's military empire tear itself apart from the inside. The first assassin vaulted silently over the stone railing, a serrated dagger gleaming dangerously in his gloved hand. He lunged forward immediately, the poisoned blade aiming directly for the exact center of my chest. I closed my eyes without a flinch, entirely prepared to embrace the cold, peaceful relief of eternal oblivion. The fatal strike never connected with my fragile mortal flesh. A violent, explosive crash shattered the heavy wooden doors of my bedchamber entirely off their iron hinges. Dominic moved faster than any human I could possibly track, crossing the vast room in a fraction of a second. He did not wear his intimidating dark iron armor or his heavy, authoritative velvet cloaks. He was dressed only in a loose linen shirt, his lean, perfectly sculpted torso shifting with lethal, unbridled intent. He possessed the raw, terrifying power of an apex predator defending its absolute most prized possession. There was zero clumsy bulk to his fluid movements, only an elegant, devastating martial perfection. Dominic intercepted the assassin's forward strike with his bare, entirely unprotected left hand. The serrated, venom-coated blade sliced deeply through his palm and embedded itself firmly in his forearm. He did not recoil from the gruesome injury, nor did he utter a single sound of physical pain. Through our unsevered magical tether, I felt a sickening, burning jolt of black venom entering his bloodstream. Dominic simply twisted his wrist, snapping the assassin's arm backward with a horrifying, echoing crunch of bone. With his uninjured hand, he seized the intruder by the throat and threw him effortlessly off the high balcony. The second and third assassins breached the stone railing exactly as the first one fell screaming into the abyss. They attacked with absolute desperation, their weapons coated heavily in a rare, paralyzing nightshade. Dominic stepped directly in front of me, shielding my body completely with his towering, sinewy frame. He took every glancing blow meant for me, allowing the poisoned blades to slice across his shoulders and chest. He fought back with a breathtaking, beautiful savagery that left absolutely no room for mercy. Within agonizing seconds, the remaining two assassins lay completely motionless on the cold stone of the balcony. Their dark blood pooled rapidly, soaking into the hem of my simple charcoal wool dress. Dominic stood perfectly still amidst the carnage, his broad chest heaving as he fought the immediate, terrifying effects of the poison. Dark, toxic blood dripped steadily from the deep, jagged lacerations on his elegant arms and shoulders. The venom was actively burning through his veins, an excruciating agony I could vividly feel pulsing through our mate bond. I immediately severed my empathic connection to his mind, absolutely refusing to share his physical torment. The royal guards finally stormed onto the balcony, their swords drawn and their faces pale with sheer terror. "Leave us," Dominic growled, his voice a dark, monstrous rumble that commanded immediate, unquestioning obedience. The captain of the guard hesitated for a fraction of a second, staring in horror at the king's bleeding, poisoned wounds. "Now," Dominic commanded softly, the raw, unfiltered authority in his tone leaving absolutely no room for debate. The guards retreated instantly, dragging the shattered remains of the wooden doors shut behind them. We were entirely alone again, surrounded by the heavy metallic scent of fresh blood and freezing mountain wind. Dominic slowly turned to face me, his striking, angular face deathly pale and his amber eyes clouded by the toxic venom. He staggered forward a single step, his usual fluid grace heavily compromised by the paralyzing poison ravaging his nervous system. He collapsed heavily onto his knees directly at my feet, his blood smearing thickly against the white stone. The most dangerous, feared tyrant in the known world looked entirely broken, utterly dependent on my mercy. He reached out with a violently trembling, blood-stained hand, lightly grasping the dark fabric of my dress. He was silently begging for a single touch of comfort, a tiny shred of validation for his agonizing sacrifice. He had just allowed himself to be poisoned to protect a woman who openly wished for his death. I looked down at him, my expression remaining completely blank and entirely devoid of any human pity. "You bled for absolutely nothing," I whispered coldly, stepping backward to deliberately pull my dress from his weak grasp. I was entirely ready to welcome their blades. A profound, shattering grief instantly fractured the fierce, intimidating mask of his breathtaking face. "I would burn this entire world to ash before I let anyone take you from me," he choked out, coughing up a spatter of dark blood onto the stones. "You already burned my entire world, Dominic," I replied, my voice as hard and unforgiving as the northern ice. I turned my back on his bleeding, kneeling form without a second glance. I walked slowly and deliberately back into the freezing bedchamber. I did not call for the royal physicians to save him, and I did not offer him a single bandage to stop the bleeding. I sat down in the heavy armchair by the dying fire, listening to his ragged, poisoned breathing echoing from the balcony. He had just saved my life at the immense cost of his own loyal soldiers and his own physical health. But as I stared deeply into the fading flames, I realized a terrifying, undeniable truth about my vengeance. I did not just want him to die a quick death anymore. I wanted him to live long enough to fully realize that his unconditional love for me would be his absolute ruin. The venom of the nightshade finally dragged the invincible Northern King into a deep, deathly coma. Dominic lay motionless on the massive silk-draped bed, his skin the color of crushed ash. Even in his violently weakened state, his lean, perfectly sculpted physique retained a striking, dangerous elegance. There was no bulky mass to soften his sharp edges, only the hard lines of a warrior temporarily felled. The magical bond connecting our souls pulsed with a weak, erratic rhythm that mirrored his failing heart. I stood at the foot of the bed, watching his shallow breaths with absolute, unfeeling calculation. The heavy oak doors of the royal bedchamber rattled violently against their broken iron hinges. Panicked voices echoed from the stone corridor, demanding immediate access to their fallen sovereign. The royal physicians, the captain of the guard, and the remaining warlords were practically tearing the castle apart. They expected to find a weeping, terrified captive bride cowering in the corner of the room. I calmly walked to my vanity and picked up the heavy black diamond crown Dominic had forced upon me. I placed it deliberately on my head, feeling the cold weight anchor my spine into perfect, uncompromising posture. I smoothed the dark fabric of my charcoal dress and walked directly toward the ruined doors. I pulled the heavy wood open just enough to step through, immediately blocking their entry with my body. A dozen heavily armored men froze instantly, their frantic shouts dying in their throats at the sight of me. They looked at the pristine, unmarked queen standing before them, and then at the dark blood staining the floor behind me. "The king is resting," I stated, my voice echoing with a cold, terrifying authority that left no room for debate. The chief physician stepped forward, his hands trembling as he clutched his bag of ancient remedies. "Your Grace, the poison must be drawn out immediately before it reaches his heart." "No one touches him," I commanded softly, channeling the exact, lethal tone Dominic used in the Great Hall. A murmur of genuine outrage and deep confusion rippled through the gathered northern soldiers. A burly commander, a known loyalist to the disgraced General Vane, rested his hand aggressively on his sword hilt. "You cannot command us, Crescent Witch," the commander sneered, stepping dangerously close to my personal space. "The king is incapacitated, and we will not take orders from a spoil of war." I did not flinch, nor did I break eye contact with the towering, hostile warlord. I simply tapped the black diamonds of my crown with one steady, elegant finger. "He named me your god," I reminded them smoothly, my voice cutting through the freezing mountain air like glass. "And just hours ago, he strangled your greatest general simply for looking at me with disrespect." The commander hesitated, a flash of undeniable terror breaking through his arrogant military facade. They all remembered the horrifying ease with which Dominic had sacrificed his own empire for my sake. "If you cross this threshold against my orders, he will flay you alive the moment he wakes," I whispered. The absolute truth of my words settled heavily over the armored men, paralyzing their rebellious intent. They were not afraid of me, but they were mortally terrified of the monster who worshipped me. "Captain," I called out, turning my gaze to the rigid leader of the royal guard. "Arrest this commander for treason, and immediately purge the inner keep of anyone loyal to his faction." The captain swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically between his fellow soldier and his untouchable queen. "It will be done, Your Majesty," the captain finally conceded, bowing his head in total, defeated submission. I stood in the doorway for 3 straight days, ruling the northern fortress through sheer psychological terror. I strategically dismantled Dominic's inner circle, replacing ambitious warlords with terrified, unquestioning sentinels. I did not run into the frozen wasteland to freeze to death as a forgotten martyr. I stayed to slowly digest the empire that had mercilessly swallowed my home. On the twilight of the 3rd day, the weak, erratic pulse through the mate bond suddenly spiked with sharp clarity. I turned away from the balcony and walked slowly back into the dim, suffocating bedchamber. Dominic's amber eyes were open, staring blankly at the vaulted ceiling as his supernatural healing finally purged the venom. He turned his head slowly, wincing as the deep lacerations on his shoulders pulled tightly against the bandages. His gaze found me standing in the shadows, still wearing his crown and my dark mourning dress. I watched the realization hit him, completely expecting his anger at discovering I had hijacked his military command. Instead, a devastatingly pure, broken relief washed entirely over his striking, pale features. He did not care that I had isolated his generals or locked his trusted commanders in the dungeons. He only cared that I was still standing inside his bedroom. Dominic weakly pushed himself up onto one elbow, his chest heaving with the massive effort. "You stayed," he whispered, his voice incredibly hoarse, tearing at his parched throat. "You did not run." He reached out a trembling hand toward me, entirely oblivious to the lethal trap I had just built around him. I walked to the side of the bed, looking down at the ruthless tyrant who had literally bled to keep me. "I am the Queen of the North now, Dominic," I said coldly, offering him absolutely no comfort. "Where else would I possibly go?" He let out a broken, breathless laugh, pressing his face weakly against the dark fabric of my dress. He was entirely blind to the fact that the cage he built for me was now firmly locked from the inside. The recovery of the Northern King was a terrifyingly swift and silent process. Within a week, the toxic nightshade was entirely purged from his resilient, ancient magical blood. Yet, he did not leave the confines of the royal bedchamber to reclaim his fractured, bleeding empire. He allowed me to hold court in his place, wearing his black diamond crown and dispensing his absolute justice. Every evening, I returned to the suffocating silence of the royal quarters, finding him waiting in the shadows. He possessed a lean, lethal elegance that even the lingering pallor of near death could not completely diminish. There was absolutely no bulky, monstrous weakness in his frame, only the coiled, breathtaking stillness of a captive predator. He watched my every movement with those burning amber eyes, utterly intoxicated by my newfound cruelty. Tonight, I decided to test the absolute, sickening limit of his fated, twisted obsession. I stood before the roaring stone hearth, watching the flames reflect against the heavy iron chains I had ordered the blacksmith to forge. They were crafted from cold iron, deeply etched with ancient runes designed to entirely suppress a sovereign's magical aura. Dominic stepped gracefully out of the shadows, his bare chest still marked by the faded silver scars of the assassin's poison. He looked at the heavy chains resting on the stone floor, his striking expression completely unreadable. "You have stripped me of my loyal generals, Sophia," he murmured, his voice a smooth, dark velvet caress. "You have taken my iron throne, my vast armies, and the absolute fear of my conquered subjects." He took a slow, deliberate step toward me, his movements fluid and entirely devoid of any clumsy hesitation. What else could you possibly demand from the broken ghost of a king? I met his intense gaze, my heart hardened into an unbreakable fortress of pure, unadulterated ice. "I want your physical freedom, Dominic," I stated, my voice echoing with ruthless, unfeeling clarity. I want you to descend into the deepest, darkest dungeon of this obsidian fortress. I want you to wear these cold iron chains and lock yourself in the dark, entirely at my mortal mercy. The silence that immediately followed my demand was so absolute it felt as though the very castle held its breath. I fully expected the tyrant to finally snap, to realize the sheer absurdity of surrendering his ultimate liberty to his captive bride. I waited for the terrifying roar of a conquered sovereign violently reclaiming his stolen pride. Instead, a slow, chillingly beautiful smile touched the sharp corners of his pale mouth. It was a smile of pure, twisted devotion, entirely devoid of any rational human sanity. If I step into that rusted cage, my beautiful bird, will you finally believe that I am yours? He asked softly. I will believe that my slaughtered kingdom is partially avenged, I replied, refusing to offer him a single drop of affection. Dominic did not hesitate for another fraction of a second. He walked gracefully toward the heavy iron chains, his lean muscles shifting flawlessly under his scarred skin. He picked up the heavy metal cuffs, entirely unfazed by the magic-suppressing runes burning viciously against his magical aura. With a sickeningly sharp click, he fastened the heavy iron securely around his own perfect wrists. A violent shudder tore through his sinewy frame as his ancient, terrifying magic was abruptly suffocated by the runes. He fell heavily to his knees before me, entirely mortal, entirely vulnerable, and entirely mine. The invincible architect of my total destruction was now a willing prisoner kneeling in the ashes of his own pride. Lead the way, my queen, he whispered, looking up at me with an obsession so deep it bordered on the divine. I picked up the heavy iron leash attached to his binding collar, my hands completely steady and utterly cold. I led the undisputed master of the North out of his luxurious chambers and down into the abyssal depths of his own prison. The heavily armored guards lining the stone corridors averted their eyes in sheer, absolute horror. They were watching their living god walk willingly into hell, led by the fragile hands of a broken princess. When we finally reached the lowest level of the damp, freezing dungeons, I guided him into the absolute darkest cell. The heavy iron door slammed shut behind him, the deafening echo sealing his absolute, undeniable ruin. I locked the rusted cage, holding the heavy brass key tightly against the charcoal wool of my dress. Through the iron bars, he stared at me from the shadows, his amber eyes burning brighter than the dying torches. You hold the key to my cage, Sophia, Dominic murmured from the oppressive, freezing darkness. But remember, my little bird, you are the only one who will ever come down here to feed the monster. I turned my back on his chilling words, walking rapidly away into the cold, silent corridors of my new empire. I had completely won the war, I had destroyed the king, yet a terrifying, icy dread finally began to settle in my frozen heart. 5 brutal, freezing winters had passed since I locked the Northern King in his own abyss. I sat upon the jagged iron throne, a young and flawless queen ruling an empire of absolute violence. The hardened warlords of the North now bowed exclusively to my simple charcoal dresses. They trembled at the cold, unforgiving weight of the black diamond crown resting upon my head. My whispered word was the absolute, undeniable law across the vast, snow-covered territories. I had successfully rebuilt the ghost of my fallen kingdom upon the very bones of its executioners. To the entire outside world, I was the ultimate conqueror, the captive bride who devoured a tyrant. Yet, every single day ended exactly the same terrifying way. The sun would eventually set, casting long, bloody shadows across the polished obsidian of the Great Hall. I would dismiss my terrified court with a single, elegant wave of my perfectly manicured hand. The massive iron doors would swing shut, leaving me entirely alone in the suffocating silence of my absolute power. I would step down from the dais and walk directly toward the hidden stone staircase. I would pick up the heavy iron ring holding a single, ancient brass key. Then, I would begin my daily, inescapable descent into the paralyzing darkness of the lower dungeons. The air grew progressively colder with every step, smelling thickly of damp earth and rusted metal. The heavily armored guards stationed at the upper levels immediately averted their eyes as I passed. They knew exactly where the young, beautiful Queen of the North went every single midnight. They knew I was going down to feed the terrifying monster who willingly slept in chains. I reached the absolute lowest level, walking down the long, narrow corridor lit by a single dying torch. The heavy iron door of his specific cell stood exactly as I had left it 24 hours ago. I inserted the brass key into the rusted lock, the sharp click echoing violently in the absolute silence. I pushed the heavy door open, stepping into a freezing cage devoid of any mortal comfort. Dominic sat quietly on the stone floor, the heavy, rune-carved chains pulling heavily around his perfectly still form. 5 years of darkness and magic-suppressing iron had not ruined his breathtaking, lethal elegance. His body remained fiercely sculpted, composed of lean, sinewy muscle entirely devoid of any clumsy bulk. His dark hair was longer now, falling wildly across the sharp, beautiful angles of his pale face. He slowly lifted his head as the faint torchlight spilled across the cold floorboards. Those piercing amber eyes remained as bright and dangerously obsessive as the day he destroyed my home. He did not look like a broken prisoner wasting away in the dark. He looked like a patient, starving predator who had finally cornered his ultimate prize. "You are late tonight, my beautiful little bird," he murmured, his dark, velvet voice vibrating perfectly through the mate bond. The sound of his voice instantly sent a cruel, uncontrollable shiver straight down my spine. "The border lords required my attention," I answered coldly, maintaining my rigid, emotionless posture. "You mean they required my empire's blades," he corrected softly, a chillingly proud smile touching his lips. He shifted gracefully, the heavy iron chains clanking loudly as he moved closer to the bars. He reached his long, elegant fingers through the rusted iron, leaving his palm open and waiting. I hated him with every single, shattered fragment of my broken soul. I despised the violent blood on his hands and the ruthless cruelty of his past conquests. Yet, my feet moved entirely of their own accord, stepping closer to the freezing iron bars. I slowly raised my own hand and placed my fragile fingers directly into his calloused palm. The moment our skin connected, a violent, golden spark of the mate bond flared brightly in the dark room. He closed his eyes, inhaling sharply as he absorbed the tiny, agonizing fragment of warmth I offered him. "You have conquered the entire world, Sophia," he whispered, pressing his forehead gently against the iron bars. "Is the throne everything you ever wanted?" I stared at his chained wrists, realizing for the first time the absolute, horrifying truth of my existence. I could order the immediate execution of 1,000 men with a single breath. I could command vast armies to march across the frozen oceans and burn entire continents. But I could not spend a single night without walking down into this freezing, terrifying abyss. I had systematically stripped him of his title, his freedom, and his formidable magic. I had locked him in the deepest, darkest hole to punish him for the murder of my family. But as he gently stroked the back of my trembling hand, the illusion of my total victory shattered completely. He had not surrendered his empire because he was suddenly weak. He had surrendered his empire to make himself my absolute, undeniable center of gravity. I had built my entire life, my entire reign, and my entire vengeance exclusively around his continued existence. If he died down here in the dark, the magical tether connecting our souls would snap and take my sanity with it. I was the undisputed queen of the completely conquered North. But my heart, my mind, and my future were permanently locked inside this rusted iron cage. "You won, Dominic," I whispered, a single, bitter tear finally escaping my eye and tracing a hot path down my cheek. "I have everything, and yet I am completely trapped." He opened his amber eyes, looking at my beautiful, weeping face with an expression of pure, unadulterated worship. He pulled my hand slightly closer, pressing a devastatingly gentle kiss against my knuckles. "We are exactly where the gods meant us to be, my queen," he promised, his voice echoing eternally in the dark. Together in the dark, until the very end of time. I did not pull my hand away, and the heavy iron door remained wide open behind me. I finally understood that the most dangerous monsters do not drag you kicking and screaming into their cages. They simply hand you the key, knowing perfectly well that you will eventually lock yourself inside.